She found the key on the front step at 7:15 in the morning, which was how she found most things, by almost stepping on them. It was a single key on a plain ring. No tag, no fob, nothing to identify it except that it was clearly a house key, and clearly not hers, and clearly belonged to the brownstone next door, which had been empty for 6 weeks and was no longer empty as of yesterday afternoon, when a moving truck had taken up the entire left side of the street for 4 hours, and the man directing it had spoken to no one, and accepted no help, and carried at least a third of the furniture himself. Nora had watched from her kitchen window the way you watch things in a new neighborhood when you are trying to understand what kind of place you have moved into at an angle without appearing to watch. She picked up the key. She told Milo to put his shoes on. He was 8 and had strong opinions about which shoes, and this was not the morning for it. So she said the blue ones, and he said the grey ones, and she said fine, the grey ones. And he appeared in the hallway 60 seconds later, with both shoes on the wrong feet, which she corrected without comment, because some mornings the only way through was to treat the small disasters as normal and keep moving. She gave him the last of the cereal with the last of the milk, and ate a piece of toast standing at the counter, and looked at the key on the table. It was a Tuesday. She had the early shift at the library starting at 9, which meant she needed to leave by 8:30, which meant she had exactly enough time to return the key and get back and change out of the shirt Milo had just leaned against with his spoon still in his hand. She changed the shirt. She gave Milo his backpack. She knocked on the door of the brownstone next door at 7:40 with Milo standing 1 step behind her, holding the key out in front of him like a very small bellhop. The man who opened the door was on the phone. He was wearing a suit jacket over a shirt that had not been ironed, which was either the beginning of getting dressed or the end of having slept in his clothes. And he had the specific, distracted look of someone who was conducting 2 conversations simultaneously and winning neither. He looked at Nora. He looked at Milo. He looked at the key in Milo's outstretched hand and reached forward to take it without breaking his sentence, which was something about a quarterly report and a deadline that was apparently someone else's fault. He had the key. He was already turning back inside. Nora would have left. She had left. Essentially, she had shifted her weight back toward her own front steps and was preparing to say, "Have a good morning," in the direction of his retreating back. Then she saw the children. The door had swung half open when he turned, and through it she could see a front room that still had boxes stacked against the walls and a large sectional couch that had not yet been oriented toward anything in particular. And on the floor in front of the couch, 2 children, a boy, older, maybe 9 or 10, sitting with his back against the couch and his knees pulled up and a book open in his lap that he was not reading. A girl, younger, maybe 5 or 6, sitting cross-legged with a cereal box between her knees, tilting it toward her and then tilting it back. And the cereal box was clearly empty because nothing came out either way, and she kept tilting it with the patience of someone who had not yet accepted what the evidence was telling her. On the floor beside her was a bowl. Nothing in the bowl. Nothing in the box. The girl tilted the box one more time and then looked into the top of it for a long moment and set it down. Nora said, "Excuse me." The man did not turn around. She said it again, not louder but differently, and he turned. She said, "I don't care who you are. Your children need to eat." She said it the way she said most things, which was directly and without much decoration, because she had found over 34 years that decoration usually just delayed the point. He looked at her. He said something into the phone and then lowered it and said, "I was going to." She said, "When?" He opened his mouth and closed it. The girl on the floor picked up the empty cereal box and tilted it one more time. Nora said, "Do you have food in the house?" He said, "We just moved in." She said, "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being spoken to this way and was trying to decide how to respond to it. She did not wait for him to decide. She looked at Milo and said, "Go get the eggs and the bread from the counter." He turned and went without questioning it, because he was 8 and because she had used. The voice that meant this was not a discussion. She turned back to the man in the doorway and said, "My name is Nora. I live next door. May I come in?" He stepped back. She came in. The kitchen was in better shape than the living room, which meant the boxes were smaller and there were fewer of them. But the refrigerator held 3 bottles of water, a container of leftover something from a restaurant, and a block of cheese that was going to need to be assessed before it was used. She found a pan in the 3rd box she opened. She found butter in the door of the refrigerator behind the water. Milo came back with the eggs and the bread and set them on the counter, and then went and sat next to the boy on the floor, because that was what Milo did. He sat next to people, without introduction, without asking, which was something his pediatrician called a gift for social intuition, and which Nora privately thought was just the thing that happened when a child grew up needing to read rooms carefully and found that being present in them worked better than hanging back. The girl came to the kitchen doorway and watched. She had a serious face for her age, the kind of face that had been paying attention for a long time. Nora said, "What's your name?" The girl said, "Rosie." Nora said, "Do you like scrambled eggs?" "Rosie." Rosie considered this with genuine deliberation and said, "I like them if they're not wet." Nora said, "I make dry eggs." Rosie nodded and came further into the kitchen and pulled herself up onto one of the bar stools and watched Nora cook with the focused attention of someone learning a skill. The man came into the kitchen at some point during the eggs and stood on the other side of the island and watched in a different way than Rosie, watched not focused but uncertain. The way people stand in spaces they are responsible for, but do not yet know how to inhabit. He had put the phone away. He said, "You don't have to do this." She said, "I know." She buttered the toast and cut it diagonally because that was how Milo liked it, and she assumed children generally. And she called to the living room and said breakfast was ready. And Milo came in, and the boy came in behind him with his book still in his hand, held with a finger between the pages to mark his place, which told her something about him, that he was the kind of child who was ready to leave any situation quickly and needed to know he could return to where he had been. She set 4 plates on the island. She looked at the man and said, "There are 4 plates." He looked at the plates and then at her, and then he pulled out the bar stool on the end and sat down. She poured juice from the container she found in the 3rd cupboard she checked and set glasses down, and the 4 children, 2 hers and 2 his, ate scrambled eggs and toast on a Tuesday morning in a kitchen that still had the smell of cardboard boxes and new paint. And the man at the end of the counter ate too, quietly, without the phone, and did not say anything for a while. When the plates were empty, Rosie said, "These were good eggs." Nora said, "Thank you." Rosie said, "They weren't wet at all." The boy looked up from where he had quietly reopened his book against the edge of his plate and said, "Owen," to Milo, which was apparently an introduction, and Milo said, "Milo," and they looked at each other with the evaluating calm of children deciding whether something is worth their time. And then Owen said, "What are you reading?" And Milo said, "I'm not reading anything right now." And Owen said, "No, I mean, what books do you read?" And that was sufficient because Milo had opinions about books, and Owen appeared to have opinions about books, and the conversation they began in low voices at the end of the island had nothing to do with the adults and did not require them. Nora collected the plates. The man said, "You don't have to wash them." She said, "I'm not going to. I'm going to stack them in the sink, and you're going to wash them later." He said, "All right." She dried her hands on the dish towel she found on the counter and picked up her bag from where she had set it by the door and said she had to get to work. He said, "I don't know your last name." She said, "Callahan." Nora Callahan. He said, Callum Harte. He said it the way people say their names when they are used to the name doing a certain amount of work in a room and are waiting to see if it does it. She said, nice to meet you, Callum. She called to Milo that they were leaving. Milo said goodbye to Owen, and Owen said goodbye to Milo, and Rosie waved at Nora from the bar stool without getting down, which Nora took as a high compliment. She was on the front step when she heard him behind her. She turned. He was in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not fully categorize. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. It was something that sat under gratitude, something that looked like a person who has just been reminded that a thing is possible. He said, thank you. She said, get groceries today. He said, I will. She said, real ones, not just the restaurant containers. He said, I understand. She said, there's a good market 2 blocks east. They open at 8. He nodded. She turned back toward the sidewalk and pulled Milo's collar straight as they walked, and did not let herself look back. Because the thing she had seen in his expression was the kind of thing that was easy to mistake for something it was not. And she was 34 years old, and she had learned the difference between a person who needed a meal and a person who needed to be saved. And she was not in the business of saving people. And she had a library shift starting in 45 minutes. And that was all this was. It was almost all this was. She thought about the girl tilting the empty cereal box on the way to the bus stop, and she thought about the boy with the book, and she thought about what kind of morning it took to make a 10-year-old, the kind of person who kept his finger in the page so he could leave fast. And she held Milo's hand and did not think about the man in the doorway, or not much. And the bus came, and they got on it, and the city went past the windows in its ordinary Tuesday way. And Nora looked at it and felt, very quietly at the back of everything, that something had just started that she had not planned for. He came to her door the next morning at 7:50, with a paper coffee cup in each hand, and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was no longer certain it was worth saying. She opened the door in her work cardigan with a pen still tucked behind her ear from marking library returns the night before, and she looked at the 2 cups and then at him and said, I already made coffee. He said, I know. I saw your light on. She said, you watched my window. He said, I was looking at the street. She said, all right, and held the door open, and he came in. He set 1 cup on her kitchen table and kept the other, and stood near the window in the particular way of people who are not sure whether they have been invited to sit. She moved around him to check on Milo, who was still upstairs and had been called twice and would need to be called once more in a different register. She called up the stairs. She heard the specific sound of a child who was awake but pretending otherwise. She said his name in the register that meant this was the last time. Footsteps. She turned back to Callum and said, what did you want to say? He said, I have a proposition. She said, all right. He said, I need someone for the children. A consistent person. Afternoons and some mornings. Someone who can be there when I can't. He paused. I realize you have a job. She said, I do. He said, I'm not asking you to leave it. Owen and Rosie don't need pickup until 3:15, and my housekeeper comes in the mornings, so the gap is 3:15 to 6, sometimes 7, and occasional early mornings when I have calls before 7. He had clearly thought about this. He had probably written it down. She picked up the coffee he had brought and took a sip, because it seemed rude not to, and because it was better than hers, which she noted but did not say. She said, what's the compensation? He named a number. She said, that's too much. He looked briefly startled, which told her he was not accustomed to that response to that number. He said, it's the standard rate for. She said, I know what the standard rate is. What you named is significantly above it. He said, I'm aware. She looked at him. He looked back. He said, I'm asking you specifically. She said, why? He said, because Rosie ate breakfast this morning without being told to, and Owen said please at dinner last night for the first time in 4 months. I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I'll take the standard rate. He opened his mouth. She said, with adjustments. He closed his mouth. She sat down at the kitchen table and he sat across from her, which was apparently the signal that they were doing this formally, and she told him the adjustments. Dinner was eaten together, all of them. No exceptions for work calls during the meal. No screens at the table. If she was in the house, she was the adult in the house, which meant decisions about the children went through her while she was there. He did not object to any of it, which surprised her slightly, though he agreed to the dinner rule the way someone agrees to a clause in a contract they intend to revisit later. She said, the dinner rule is not revisable. He said, I didn't say anything. She said, you agreed with the tone of someone planning to renegotiate. He looked at her for a moment and then said, fine. It was the first time she had heard something that was not corporate precision in his voice. She thought it was probably closer to his actual register than anything else he had said so far. Milo came downstairs with his shoes on the right feet, which was a good sign, and looked at Callum at the kitchen table and said, are you staying for breakfast? Callum said, no. Milo said, we have the good cereal today. Callum said, what's the good cereal? Milo said, the one with the little chocolates in it. Mom only buys it when she's had a hard week. Nora said, Nilo. Milo poured himself a bowl without any sign of remorse, and Callum looked at the table, and something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the same postal code. The first week went the following way. Monday, Nora picked up Owen and Rosie from school and brought them back to the brownstone and made a snack and helped Owen with his reading comprehension worksheet, which he did not need help with and accepted the offer of anyway because sitting next to someone while you worked was different from sitting alone. Rosie drew pictures at the kitchen table and narrated them in real time to anyone who would listen, which Nora found she would. Callum came home at 6:40, which was 40 minutes past the outer edge of what they had agreed, and said he had been in a meeting and his phone had been on silent. And Nora said that was fine, and handed him the information about both children's days in the way she handed Milo's information to her own mother when her mother babysat, which was matter-of-factly and completely, and left. Tuesday. He came home at 6:15, which was within range. Wednesday. He did not come home at all, and at 8:30 she called the number he had given her, and it went to voicemail, and she left a message that said she needed to know where he was, and at 9 he called back from what sounded like an airport and said he was sorry. Something had come up. There was a number for his housekeeper, and she said she had already found it, and the children were in bed, and she would speak with him about this when he returned. He said, of course, and she could hear in the of course that he was not sure anyone had spoken to him that way in a professional context in a long time. Thursday and Friday he was home by 6. He did not explain the Wednesday. She did not ask for the explanation yet, because the first week was for observation and she was still observing. What she observed, Owen moved through the house with a precision that suggested he had spent a long time being careful not to be in the wrong place, and was only now beginning to take up the amount of space a 10-year-old was supposed to take up. Rosie had no such caution, and never had, apparently, and compensated for Owen's precision by filling every room she entered with sound and motion and the occasional crayon on surfaces that were not paper. The picture frames in the living room were all of the children, mostly recent, a few from when they were younger. There was one frame on the sideboard near the stairs that had been turned face down. Nora did not turn it over, but she noticed it the way she noticed the cereal box, the way she noticed Owen's book and his careful finger marking the page's information about how people were managing the distance between what had happened to them and what they needed to keep doing every day. On Friday evening, after Callum had come home on time and eaten dinner with them for the first time that week, pasta, which Rosie described as the best pasta of her life, which Nora suspected was a benchmark set against a fairly limited field. Nora was in the kitchen cleaning up when she heard him in the living room. He was not on the phone. He was not opening his laptop, because she could see the laptop still closed on the table by the door where he had set it when he came in. He was sitting on the sectional with Rosie, who was showing him something she had drawn during the week. A large piece of paper with what appeared to be a house and several figures of varying sizes standing outside it. And he was looking at it with the focused attention of a man who had been given something important and knew it. Rosie was explaining each figure with the seriousness of a curator. Nora heard her say, "That one is you, and that one is Owen, and that one is me, and that one is Nora, and that one is Milo." There was a pause. Callum said, "That's a lot of people." Rosie said, "We needed more people." She said it as a simple fact, the way children sometimes say the true thing because they have not yet learned to dress it up. Nora finished the dishes. She collected her bag and her jacket and said goodnight to Owen, who was reading on the other end of the couch, and to Rosie, who waved without looking up from explaining the second panel of her drawing, and to Callum, who stood when she moved toward the door, which was a formality she had not expected from him, and which she decided not to examine. He walked her to the door, which was only 8 steps from where he had been sitting, but which he did it anyway. He said, "Thank you for the week." She said, "Owen is working on long division and pretending he isn't struggling. He is. A little. It would be worth asking him about it directly because he won't bring it up on his own." Callum absorbed this and said, "I'll ask him." She said, "Tonight, if you can." He said, "Tonight." She nodded. She was at the door when he said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "The dinner rule, was that about me or about them?" She considered this honestly and said, "Both." He nodded slowly. She said goodnight and went back to her own brownstone next door, and she stood in her own kitchen for a moment in the quiet that was different from his quieters was settled, known, shaped by 2 years of learning how to be in it, and his was the kind that was still figuring out what shape it needed to take. She put the kettle on. She took the folder from the shelf above the desk in the hallway, the one she did not open often, and she sat at the kitchen table with it in front of her and the tea she had made and thought about whether to open it. She did not open it. She put it back on the shelf. She drank the tea and listened to Milo breathing through the baby monitor she still kept in his room, not because he was a baby, but because she had never managed to stop, and the street outside was quiet, and the light was on next door for a long time after it usually went off. She thought about a man sitting on a sectional, looking at a drawing of a house with too many people in it, and hearing his 6-year-old say they needed more. She thought about Owen and his finger in the book. She thought about the word needed, the way Rosie had used it, not wanted. Needed, and she thought that children were often more accurate than anyone gave them credit for, and that the 6-year-old had diagnosed the situation in 1 sentence more clearly than the adults in it had managed in a week. She washed her mug and turned off the light and went upstairs, and she did not think about the folder on the shelf, or she thought about it only once more before she fell asleep, and then she did not think about it for the rest of the night, which was as much as she could do, and which she accepted as enough. 3 weeks in, the brownstone had changed in the small ways that houses change when someone is consistently present in them. There were real groceries in the refrigerator. The boxes were unpacked, except for 2 in the back hallway that no one had committed to opening yet, which Nora understood as the boxes containing the things that needed to be decided about, rather than simply placed. The kitchen table had a bowl of fruit on it that was replaced when it emptied, which was Nora's doing, and a stack of Owen's library books that were not, which was Owen's own system, and which she left alone. Rosie's drawings had migrated from the kitchen table to the refrigerator to one entire section of the hallway wall, where Callum had put up a corkboard without being asked, which Nora noted and did not comment on because some things were better acknowledged by continuing to happen than by being named. Callum had been home by 6 every night for 11 days. She had not pointed this out. He had not mentioned it either. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after she had first walked into his kitchen, Nora was washing the dinner dishes while Owen dried them, which was a division of labor they had arrived at naturally, and which Nora appreciated because it gave them something to look at other than each other and made the kind of conversation that was easier sideways than face to face. Rosie was on the sectional with Milo, ostensibly watching something approved and educational, actually negotiating the terms of a game that seemed to involve the couch cushions and a system of rules Rosie was generating in real time. Callum had stepped outside to take a call he said would be 10 minutes. Nora had heard that before, and now estimated 25. Owen handed her a plate and said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Did you ever feel angry at someone and not want to feel angry at them?" She took the plate and dried it and set it on the stack and considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, which was seriously and without rushing to fill the space with something easier. She said, "Yes." He said, "How do you stop?" She said, "I'm not sure you stop exactly. I think you figure out what the anger is actually about, and sometimes that changes it into something else, and sometimes it doesn't, but at least you know what you're dealing with." Owen handed her another plate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm angry at my mom." He said it the way children say the true thing flatly, without performance, checking her face at the end to see if the sky had fallen. It had not. She said, "What kind of angry?" He said, "The kind where you don't want to be but you are anyway." She said, "That's a very specific kind. I know that one." He said, "Do you have it about someone?" She thought about the folder on the shelf above her desk at home, the one she had not opened in 6 weeks, the one that held the insurance correspondence and the letter from the benefits department and the name of the company printed at the top of every page. She said, "Yes." He said, "Does it go away?" She said, "I'll tell you when I know." He handed her the last glass and took the dish towel and dried his hands and seemed to settle into himself the way people settle after they have said something they have been carrying for a while and found it. Did not break anything when they put it down. He said, "She didn't leave because of us." He said it like he was rehearsing something he had been told and was still deciding whether to believe. Nora said, "Do you believe that?" He thought about it for a real amount of time, which she respected. He said, "Most of the time." She said, "That's honest." He said, "The other times I think maybe if I had been different." She said, "Owen." He looked at her. He said, "You were 9 when she left." He was quiet. She said, whatever her reasons were, they were not a 9-year-old's to fix. He looked at the dish towel in his hands and then folded it and set it on the counter with the precision she had come to recognize as his way of doing things when he was thinking hard about something else. He said, "Dad doesn't talk about it." She said, "I know." He said, "He talks about everything else, work and school and what we should eat and whether we're getting enough sleep, but not that." She said, "Some things take longer to find the words for." He said, "How long?" She said, "Different for everyone. For some people, a very long time." He nodded. He picked up his library book from the table and said good night. In the careful way he said good night, like he was leaving a door open rather than closing one, and went upstairs. Nora stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. The sounds from the living room had gone quieter, which meant Rosie and Milo had reached an accord, or one of them had fallen asleep, and the street outside was doing its ordinary Thursday evening things. She took the folder out of her bag. She had started carrying it without deciding to. The way you carry things that belong to a decision you have not made yet. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it. The papers inside were in the order she had filed them 2 years ago, the letter from the hospital, the initial diagnosis, the insurance enrollment form with the coverage dates, and then the letter, Harte Capital Group, letterhead, printed in dark grey at the top of the page. "Dear Mr. Callahan, we regret to inform you that your position has been eliminated as part of a restructuring of operations, effective 30 days from the above date. Your health insurance benefits will continue through the end of the current month. She had read this letter many times. She knew it by something that was not quite memory and not quite knowing. The way you know a thing you have read so often it has stopped being text and become texture. The end of the current month had been October 31st. Her husband's next treatment had been scheduled for November 7th. The gap was 7 days. 7 days between the end of his coverage and the appointment where they would have caught what needed to be caught. She put the letter back in the folder. She closed the folder. She sat with it under her hands for a moment. Harte Capital Group. She had heard Callum say the name on a call. Weeks ago. The morning he first opened his door in the middle of a quarterly report conversation. She had not connected it then. She had not had reason to connect it. She was connecting it now. Sitting at his kitchen table with his children's voices in the next room and his fruit bowl in front of her and the folder under her hands. And the thing she felt was not the clean anger she had carried for 2 years, but something more complicated. Something that had more directions than anger did. Something that did not have a name yet and was going to need time before it did. She heard the front door. Callum came into the kitchen still holding his phone and looked at her at the table and then at the folder and then at her face. He said, "Everything all right?" She said, "Yes." She put the folder in her bag. He put his phone on the counter and said, "Owen came upstairs." She said. He was ready for bed. He looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face she had not entirely managed to put away. He said, "What did you talk about?" She said, "He asked me something and I tried to answer it honestly." Callum said, "What did he ask?" She said, "Whether it's possible to be angry at someone and not want to be." Callum was very still for a moment. He looked at the counter. He said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him yes." He said, "Did he say who?" She said, "Yes." Callum looked at the window, at the street outside, at the ordinary Thursday evening things, and she watched him receive that information and decide what to do with it, the way you watch someone decide in real time what kind of person they are going to be in a moment that matters. He said, "I should go up." She said, "Yes." He said, "Tonight, like you said last week." She said, "Yes." He picked up his phone and put it in his pocket and went to the stairs and paused with his hand on the newel post and looked back at her and said, "Thank you." Again. She said, "Go talk to your son." He went. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after she heard his footsteps on the stairs, listening to the house settle into the particular quiet of a house where the people in it have gone to be with each other. Rosie was telling Milo something in a low voice from the couch, explaining the rules of a world Rosie had constructed during the evening and was now sharing with the generosity of someone who had just made something worth sharing. Nora sat and listened to all of it, the whole sound of the house, and thought about Owen's face when he said most of the time. She thought about Callum's hand on the newel post. She thought about the folder in her bag, and the name on the letterhead, and all the things that sat between what had happened and what was happening now. And she did not know yet what any of it meant or what she was going to do about it. But she knew that the anger she had carried for 2 years had shifted its weight in the last hour, had moved from one part of her chest to another, and that whatever it was becoming, it was not simpler than what it had been, and it was not finished, and she was going to have to be honest about it at some point, with herself first, and then, she thought, with someone else. She went to the living room and told Milo it was time. He said 5 more minutes, and she said his coat was already on his chair by the door, and Rosie said goodbye to Milo with the formality of someone ending a state visit, and Nora collected their things and walked next door through the cool evening air with her son and her bag and the folder inside it, and she unlocked her own door and turned on her own hallway light, and stood in her own kitchen and looked at the shelf above the desk. She took the folder out of her bag. She did not put it on the shelf. She put it on the table, in the center, where she would see it in the morning. She was not ready to decide what to do with it, but she was done putting it away. He brought the contract on a Monday. It was 4 pages, clean and thorough, the kind of document that had been reviewed by at least 1 lawyer and probably 2, and it laid out the terms they had agreed on verbally with the precision of someone who did not trust verbal agreements, even when he had made them himself. She had expected this. She sat at his kitchen island while Rosie was at school and Owen was at a friend's house and read through it the way she read everything, which was completely and in order, without skipping to the end. The letterhead was at the top of the first page in dark grey type, Harte Capital Group. The address below it was the downtown office building she had walked past 100 times without registering it as belonging to anything in particular. She read the name and the address, and then she read them again. And the thing that happened in her chest was not dramaticit, was quiet. The specific quiet of a thing falling into place that you have been half expecting without knowing you were expecting it. The sound a key makes when it finds the right lock after a long time of trying the wrong ones. She finished reading the contract. She capped her pen. She set it on the island surface and looked at the document, and then looked at the window and the street outside, and thought about the folder on her kitchen table, at home, which she had left there every morning for the past week, and looked at every morning, and not opened, and not put away. She thought about October 31st and November 7th. She thought about Owen at the sink asking her if it goes away. She thought about the way Callum had looked at her across this same island 4 weeks ago when she said both the dinner rule was about both and how that had been the first time she understood he was listening to something more than the literal meaning of her words. She said, "Can I take this home and sign it tonight?" He looked up from where he was standing at the counter with his own coffee and said, "Of course." She folded the contract and put it in her bag next to the folder that was already in there, the 2 documents sitting against each other in the dark. And she zipped the bag and looked at him and said, "I need to tell you something." He set his coffee down. He did not ask what. He just waited, which was a quality she had noticed in him over the past weeks. This capacity for waiting that was different from his capacity for being absent when he was present. He was very present, and the waiting was part of it, a kind of attention that did not push or fill. She said, "Your company, Harte Capital Group." He said, "Yes." She said, 2 years ago, in October, your company restructured and eliminated a division of operations. There was a round of layoffs." He said, "Yes, that's correct." She said, "My husband was in that division." The kitchen was very quiet. She heard the refrigerator hum. She heard the street outside. He said, "Nora," she said. "He was diagnosed in August of that year. The treatment plan was ongoing. He had coverage through the company's group insurance. And when he was let go, the coverage ended at the end of October." She stopped. She did not need to say the rest, because the arithmetic was not complicated, and he was not a man who struggled with arithmetic. She watched him do it. She watched his face do what faces do when a person understands something that changes the shape of everything that came before it. He said, very quietly, "November." She said, "The 7th." He was still for a long time. She sat at his island and let him be still, because she had needed stillness when she had first understood it, and she was not going to take that from him. He pulled out the stool across from her and sat down, which was not something he did. Often he was usually standing, moving, conducting something, and he sat with both hands flat on the island surface and looked at them and said, "I didn't know." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean, I didn't know him. I didn't know any of them individually. There were 412 people in that restructuring." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I signed the authorization in September. I was in the middle of..." He stopped. She said, "You don't have to explain the context." He said, "I want to." She waited. He said, "My wife had left in August. 6 weeks before. I was running the company and the house, and I was not doing either of them well, and I signed things in that period that I should have read more carefully." He said it plainly, without defensiveness, which was harder than defensiveness would have been, and which she noticed. "That's not an excuse," he said. "I know it's not an excuse." She said, "I'm not asking you for one." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not here to assign blame. Callum, I've had 2 years to be angry at a company name on a piece of paper, and I've done that, and it hasn't helped very much." She said, "I'm telling you, because you should know. Because I found out when I saw your letterhead on the contract, and I could have not said anything, and I was not willing to do that." He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "A week. I connected it when I opened the folder." He said, "The folder you put in your bag that Thursday night?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I saw it. I didn't know what it was." She said, "Now you do." He got up from the stool and went to the study off the hallway, the small room she had only been in twice, and she heard him opening a drawer and then a cabinet, and he came back with a bound folder, thick, the kind of thing that had been sitting somewhere for a long time without being the thing anyone reached for first. He set it on the island between them. The label on the cover said, "Restructuring, Summary Q4, 2 years ago, her husband's year." He said, "I haven't opened this since I filed it." She looked at it and then at him. He said, "I filed it because I didn't want to look at it, because I knew it was 412 people, and I knew I had made the decision in a state that was not my best, and I filed it so I would not have to see it." He pushed it toward the center of the island. "I'm going to read it." She said, "You don't have to do that tonight." He said, "I'm going to read it tonight." She looked at him for a moment and believed him. Not because he said it with force, but because he said it the way he said things he had already decided, which was flatly and without decoration. She picked up her bag. She said, "I'm going to go home." He stood. She said, "Don't call me tonight. Read the folder and call me tomorrow." He said, "All right." She said, "And eat something. There's soup in the refrigerator. Second shelf." He looked at the refrigerator and then at her, and for a moment something moved through his face that was not about the soup and was not about the folder and was more complicated than either of them had language for right now, and she did not try to name it, because some things needed to arrive in their own time, and naming them early was the same as forcing a window open before the weather was ready, and letting in whatever was on the other side before you had prepared for it. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table with the contract in front of her and the folder beside it, and Milo doing his homework at the other end with his pencil making the specific sound of a child working. She read the contract again. The terms were fair. The terms were, as she had said, too generous, and she had adjusted them, and he had accepted the adjustment, and the contract reflected that. She thought about the man across the island reading a bound folder about 412 people, one of whom had been her husband, and she thought about what it meant to carry a thing you had done without knowing you had done it, which was different from carrying a thing you had done on purpose, and different again from carrying a thing that had been done to you. All three were weights. None of them were the same weight. She had been carrying one kind for 2 years, and she was beginning to understand that he had been carrying another kind for the same amount of time without knowing what it was. Milo said, "Mom, what's 11 times 13? She said, 143. He wrote it down. He said, "How do you just know that?" She said, "Practice." He said, "I don't want to practice that much." She said, "You don't have to. That's what calculators are for." He nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has just been given permission to stop worrying about something, and went back to his worksheet, and the pencil sound resumed. And Nora sat with the 2 documents in front of her and the ordinary sounds of her house around her, and felt, in the way she felt things that were true before she had finished deciding whether she wanted them to be, that tomorrow's conversation was not going to be the end of something. It was going to be the beginning of something that did not have a name yet, and was going to need time, and was not going to be easy, and was also not going to be the thing she had thought it was when she first saw the letterhead, and the 2 years of quiet anger had moved all at once in a new direction. She signed the contract. She signed it carefully, on the line, with the date. She put it back in the envelope and set it on the counter where she would not forget it in the morning. She put the folder back on the table where she had been leaving it all week, not on the shelf, not in her bag, just there, where she could see it and did not have to make any decisions about it tonight. She turned off the kitchen light and told Milo it was time to wrap up and stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the light still on in the brownstone next door, visible through the side window, the study window, and she thought about him in there with the folder and the soup going uneaten on the second shelf, and she hoped he would eat it, and she thought he probably would not, and she made a decision that she would not examine too closely until morning, which was that she was not ready to walk away from this house or these children or this particular Tuesday in October that had become all the Tuesdays since, and that whatever tomorrow's conversation was, she was going to have it without deciding in advance what it meant, because she had spent 2 years deciding what things meant before they had a chance to show her, and she was done with that. And the folder on the table was not going back on the shelf, and the contract was signed, and the soup was on the second shelf. And some things you just had to leave in the place where they were visible, and trust that in the morning you would know what to do with them. She did not hear from him on Tuesday. She had said, "Call me tomorrow," and he had said, "All right." And Tuesday came and went without a call, which she noticed and did not interpret, because she had learned a long time ago that the space between what you expect and what happens is not always filled with meaning. Sometimes people need more time than they think they will. Sometimes all right means tomorrow, and sometimes it means when I'm ready, and sometimes it means both. She went to the library. She picked up Milo from school. She made dinner and helped with homework, and read the last 3 chapters of the book she and Milo had been working through together before bed. And she did not look at the light next door more than twice, and she went to sleep. Wednesday, she did not go to the brownstone. This was not a decision she announced or explained to anyone. She simply did not go. And she texted the number he had given her for scheduling and said she would not be in on Wednesday. And he replied within 4 minutes with 2 words understood. Thanks, which was not nothing but was not much, and she decided it was enough information for now and went to work. Thursday she also did not go. She thought about Owen. She thought about Rosie and the corkboard of drawings and the empty cereal box, and she thought about the soup on the second shelf that he had probably not eaten, and she sat with all of it at her kitchen table, with her tea going cold and Milo asleep upstairs. And she allowed herself to feel the full shape of what the past month had been: the fruit bowl, the dinner rule, the way Callum had stood at the newel post and said, "Thank you for a week of work," the way someone says, "Thank you for a thing they had not known they needed until they had it." She felt all of it, and she did not make any decisions about it, and she went to bed. Friday morning, Owen called her. Not Callum, Owen. On the household phone that was technically Callum's, but that all 3 of them used interchangeably. He said, "Hi, it's Owen." She said, "Hi, Owen." He said, "Are you coming today?" She said, "I'm not sure yet." He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Rosie asked Dad where you were, and he said you were busy, and she said, but she's never busy on Thursdays." Another pause. "She's not wrong." He said. She said, "I know." He said, "You don't have to tell me why." She said, "Owen." He said, "I just wanted you to know you don't have to." She sat with that for a moment, with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and she thought about the way he had said most of the time and the way he had folded the dish towel precisely when he was thinking hard about something else. And she said, "How's the long division going?" He said, "Dad sat with me on Tuesday. He's not very good at explaining it, but he tried for a long time." She said, "That's worth something." Owen said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." She said she would see him that afternoon. He said okay and hung up, and she sat for another minute with the phone in her hand, and then she put it down and finished her tea and went to work. And at 3:15 she was at the school gate when Owen and Rosie came out, and Rosie ran to her with the specific velocity of a 6-year-old who has been storing momentum and said, "You're here." In a tone that was equal parts accusation and relief, Nora said, "I'm here." Rosie took her hand without asking, and they walked back to the brownstone with Owen on Nora's other side. And the three of them were quiet together, in the easy way of people who have been walking together long enough that they have found a shared pace. And the afternoon light was low and pale, and the street smelled like October. And Nora held Rosie's hand and did not think about anything except the fact that she was walking in the direction she was walking, and it felt like the right direction, and that was enough. Callum was home when they got there. This was unusual for a Friday at 3:30. He was in the kitchen, not on the phone, not at the island with his laptop, standing at the counter with a cutting board in front of him and a pile of vegetables in a state of being chopped, which was the most domestic thing she had ever seen him do, and which was clearly not going well, because the carrot pieces were 4 different sizes and the onion had defeated him in some way that was not yet fully visible. He looked up when they came in. Rosie said, "Dad, what are you making?" He said, "Soap." Rosie looked at the cutting board and then at Nora with an expression of diplomatic neutrality. Owen said, "I can help with the carrots." Callum said, "I have the carrots." Owen looked at the carrots and looked at his father and said, "Okay," in the tone of someone deciding a battle was not worth fighting, and took his backpack upstairs. Rosie followed him, narrating something to herself that grew quieter as she climbed. Nora set her bag on the chair by the door and came to the island and looked at the cutting board. She said, "Soup is a reasonable choice." He said, "I eat the soup you leave and I thought I should learn to make it." She said, "That's the second shelf soup." He said, "Yes." She said, "The recipe isn't complicated." He said, "I'm discovering that the execution is." She looked at the onion situation and picked up the second knife from the block and said, "Move over a little." And he moved over, and she diced the onion in the way she always diced onions, which was fast and without ceremony. And he watched her do it and did not say anything, and she handed the knife back and moved to the other side of the island and sat on the stool. He said, "I read it." She said, "I know." He said, "All of it. The whole summary. The individual termination notices were in an appendix, and I read those too." He set the knife down. He turned to face her across the island. "Nora Callahan," he said. 11 years with the company. Project manager in the infrastructure division. His file had a note in it from his direct supervisor that said he was one of the most reliable people in the team, and that the decision to include him in the reduction was driven entirely by headcount targets, and not by performance. He stopped. She looked at the counter. He said, "I didn't know any of that when I signed the authorization. I know that doesn't change what happened." She said, "No." He said, "I've had my lawyer look into what reparations are possible under the circumstances, and I want you to know that's happening. But I also know that's not what this conversation is about." She looked at him. He said, "I don't know how to say I'm sorry for something of this size. I don't think there's a way to do it that doesn't sound like it's trying to close the account. And I'm not trying to close it." She said, "What are you trying to do?" He looked at her directly, the same way he had looked at her on the doorstep on the very first morning, with the focused attention she had identified then as a man trying to determine if something was real. He said, "I'm trying to stay in the room." The kitchen was quiet. From upstairs she could hear Owen and Rosie, the low sound of their presence in the house. The particular sound of a house that has children in it going about their ordinary afternoon. The cutting board was in front of him with the uneven carrots on it and the soup in its early stages on the stove, and it smelled like something that was going to be fine if someone paid attention to it. She said, "The soup is going to need another 20 minutes on low." He said, "All right." She said, "And the carrots should be smaller." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to keep coming here." He was still. She said, "Not because of the contract. Though the contract is signed, and I left it on your front step this morning. Because Owen asked me a question 3 weeks ago that I told him I'd answer when I knew, and I don't know yet, and I think I need more time in this house before I do." He said, "You can have as much time as you need." she said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not finished being complicated about this." "I don't think I can be uncomplicated about it yet," he said. "I'm not asking you to be," she said. "I know. I'm telling you anyway." He looked at her across the island and said, "Nora," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "You told me the truth first." On Monday, I noticed he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the knife and began working on the carrots again, with more attention to the size this time, and she sat on the stool and watched him, and felt the afternoon light shift through the window and listened to the house doing its ordinary Friday things around them. Owen came down at some point and silently corrected the carrot situation by taking over his section of the cutting board with the efficiency of a child who had decided the adults needed assistance and was providing it without commentary. Rosie came down and climbed onto her stool and reported that Milo had texted Owen, which meant the two of them had exchanged numbers at some point without telling anyone, which Nora filed away for a separate conversation. The soup went on properly and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and Callum set the table without being asked. 4 places. And then, after a moment, he got a 5th plate from the cabinet and set it next to Owen's. Nora looked at the 5th plate. She looked at him. He said, "Milo gets out at 4:30 on Fridays." She said, "He does." He said, "I thought you might want to go get him." She picked up her coat from the chair and said she would be back in 20 minutes. And Rosie said to tell Milo there was soup, and Owen said nothing but raised one hand briefly from the cutting board in a gesture that managed to contain, in its economy, everything it needed to say. She walked the 2 blocks to Milo's school in the October afternoon, in the low light, with the smell of soup still on her jacket, and the contract delivered, and the folder at home on the table where she had left it, not on the shelf, not put away, just there. She thought about Daniel, which was what she called him in her mind, always by his full name when she was thinking about him carefully, and just D when she was not being careful. And she thought about what he would have made of the past month, and she thought he probably would have had something useful to say about it, and she was sorry she could not ask him. She thought he would have liked Owen. She thought he definitely would have liked Rosie. She was not ready to think much beyond that, and she did not have to be, and that was all right. Milo was at the gate when she got there, talking to another boy about something that required both of them to use their hands, and he looked up and saw her and said, "Hey, Mum," with the easy unconcern of someone for whom a parent's arrival is neither remarkable nor unwelcome, just the ordinary shape of the afternoon. And she said, "Hey, soup's ready next door." He said, "What kind?" She said, "The kind your friend's dad made for the first time, and it's going to be fine." Milo said, "Is it going to be the good kind of fine, or the kind where you say fine but you mean it needs salt?" She said, "Probably needs salt." He said, "I can fix that." And he said goodbye to the other boy and fell into step beside her, and they walked back in the October light together. And when they got to the brownstone, Nora opened the door without knocking because she did not knock anymore, and Rosie yelled from the kitchen that the soup was almost ready. And Owen came to the top of the stairs and said there was room at the table, and Milo said great and took off his shoes by the door without being asked, which was not something he did at home, and which Nora decided to observe without comment, and she hung up her coat and walked into the kitchen where the soup was on the stove and the table was set for 5. And the light above the table was warm in the way that light in kitchens is warm when people have been cooking in them, and she sat down, and that was where she was.